Good afternoon and welcome to the first day of our Research Methods Symposium, Boundaries 2021 at RV College of Architecture, Bangalore. I'm Salila Vanka and I teach at RV. The seeds of this symposium were sown in an ongoing research methods elective that my colleague Madhuri Rao and I teach this semester. And in our bid to expose our students to creative research methods, we took forth a proposal to our principal, Dr. Bhavani, saying we'd like to invite some speakers during the semester to our class. And he suggested, and it was a great suggestion, he said, why don't we take it out to a larger audience and have something on a larger forum? And so here we are today with this symposium. So thanks, sir, for that. So in thinking of the title of our symposium and its intent, I'm reminded of the words of psychoanalyst Helen Deutsch, who said, after all, the ultimate goal of all research is not objectivity, but truth. Through every decision that went into the making of this event, we highlight our own twofold position regarding research. One, the truth may not always be objective or convenient, but it must be sought and told. Two, we will never attain complete knowledge of any subject, but in our quest for answers, we would do very well to also seek answers on the boundaries and in the gray areas between disciplines and systems. Anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston famously said, research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. If indeed it is purposive curiosity that triggers research and what brings us all to this forum today, then rest assured that we are in very good company with our speakers today and tomorrow. With the help of our speakers, we are excited to embark on our journey in exploring methods that question, expand, cross, bridge, overlap, and blur boundaries in the process of knowledge building. In anticipation of a stimulating evening of talks and discussions, I extend a very warm welcome and thanks to all our speakers. Let me quickly outline the program for today. We will first have 3 talks by the speakers, each talk punctuated with 1 question from our moderators, Professor Deepa Suryaprakash and Professor Meera Vasudev. After the talks, the floor will be open to questions from the audience. Please do type your questions in the Q&A box. And I now invite our principal, Dr. Uppi Bhavani, to officially mark the beginning of the symposium. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Salila. You made my job simple by giving the preamble of the program, and I would like to say that this discussion we started when we started offering this program elective in our 8th semester, and this is something new we started under my chairmanship as a board of studies, the chairman of VTU, and we thought that it is important that we initiate the research thinking among our students at undergraduate level. So we have the program at the master's level also in research methodology. I remember if 15 years back, if we talk about the research in architecture, people would look at you with giving you some kind of a strange look. Now the research is very much part of the academic premises, and even the practicing architects also finding time to indulge in a little bit of research. Architecture is one field which gets influenced by most of the things which are happening around us, what is happening in history, what is happening in technology, what is happening in arts. So I think when we started thinking about the theme for this talk, a lot of deliberation took place between Dr. Salila and her colleagues, and then the consensus arrived at that, okay, why don't we theme the talk around the work which is being done, the remarkable work which is being done by some of the young minds in the field of arts, humanities, and architecture, and also in urban studies. And the discussion and the deliberation were taken further, and they arrived at a good format for the program. And to my appreciation, remarkable names were identified, and some of them are here on this platform today. So on behalf of the school, I take privilege to extend a very hearty welcome to Ms. Alia Rizvi, an independent writer who writes on the urban issues. We also have Mansi Rao, architect and researcher, Dr. Srajna Kaikini, architect and art historian, if I'm correct to say so. Then we'll also have tomorrow Dr. Kush Patel, architect, academician, and researcher, and Miss Arju Mistry, artist and educator, and Miss Swati Janu, the founder, Social Design Collaborative. So on behalf of the School of Architecture, RV College of Architecture, the management, I extend very warm welcome to all the resource person, distinguished resource person to this forum, and also a very warm welcome to all the participants who have joined us on this platform. So without making much time, because we're already slightly late behind the schedule, I would request the coordinator to please start with the program. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Thank you very much. I now invite our student Ari to introduce our first speaker.
Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to you all. Our first speaker for the evening is Ali Rizvi, who's a history writer, curator, and founder of Native Place, a collaborative studio for place-based storytelling, where she works with memory and imagination to find new ways in which to connect people to place more meaningfully through stories. This is done through information design, research-based writing, documentation, and book publication projects for heritage, travel and culture, and experience design, curatorial practices in placemaking that focus on story walks, culture tours, and community engagements. Her collaborative curatorial projects include the Chikpete Metro Station Art in Transit Public Art Project with Art in Transit at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology, and the Cubbon Park Wayfinding and Signage Project with Sensing Local. She was also an invitee to the Bangalore Tourism Advisory Committee initiated by the Ministry of Tourism, Government of Karnataka, and co-facilitated the Tiger Comes to Town, a public history project in association with the Archaeological Survey of India, while working as a curator at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology. In collaboration with Arzu Mistry, Art in Transit, Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology, she is the co-founder, designer and facilitator of the Memory Maps project, a psychogeographic exploration that has been visualized as a series of community engagements through arts practice-based placemaking workshops. This project seeks to integrate the memories and experiences of a locality with walking and arts practice to create a response to the city, locate yourself in it, and build pride of place. She is the author of Another World, a social history of the Bangalore cantonment, and has written for publications and dailies, including the National Geographic Traveller, and also been a weekly columnist on Bangalore's local culture for the Bangalore Mirror. Welcome, ma'am. We invite you to start the presentation.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking everybody who has brought me here today. Madhuri, who's not here, Salida, Mansi, Principal, RV College of Architecture, everybody who is putting this event together today. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be here. I am primarily a person of words. I work with text. So it is intimidating to be amongst people from architecture and design. But I am going to look forward to this as an enriching experience that is going to teach me much more than what I've come here with today. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. And through early explorations in the city. Is my screen visible to everyone?
Not yet, ma'am.
Not yet? Okay. One moment. Yeah. Now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So, So when I started out as a travel writer, my story literally began there about many years ago when I was working on some culture stories and I was interviewing the monks in Bailakuppe. And I spent some time speaking to them, and then serendipitously, a few weeks later, there were conversations with friends from the Kashmiri Pandit community. There was a Palestinian man I met making shawarmas in Frasertown, and I did a story on the Sindhi community and their journey to Bangalore post-partition. And when I was speaking with them, what struck me was that they all spoke in various ways of the idea of home and the homeland. And I realized that for all of them, the idea of home is an imagined landscape now, but there is also the comfort of the idea of the return to home at some point, which was something that everybody held on to. And then it got me thinking about me and my relationship with where I live, because I'm an old Bangalorean, as we call the city today. And like many displaced people, I realized, went through a gamut of emotions about the city, which was from feeling alienated to isolated to displaced to sad to sometimes grief, sometimes anger. And like most old Bangaloreans, we all huddle together when we meet and speak about the Bangalore that was versus the Bangalore that is. And unlike the people I had spoken with earlier, I realized that I did not have the idea of the imagined home or the comfort of the return, because the reality of my lost space confronted me every time I walked out the door. When the physical markers of my existence in this city had been removed, the places that were familiar to me, my pathways, my nodal points had all disappeared in the last 20 years, I began to question these emotional responses I had to the city and ask myself, who am I therefore today, if everything that defined me spatially has gone? So very intuitively, I started out by wanting to reconnect to the city by walking. And I walked, I met people, I wrote, and I eventually came to the questions of, why am I a Bangalorean? What does home mean to me? And this was still a very vague concept. I didn't have an answer for this, but I did begin to think about the city. And a little while later, as I was walking through the Chickpet area, I came upon this very beautiful old building. And I had walked past many times and I had never walked in. This time I actually did. And when I walked into the building, a shopkeeper there lent me the key. I came upon this image on the wall. And it took me a little while to figure out what this image was. Eventually, I realized that this was an imprint. It was rust of a bed that had been propped up against the wall, and then it had just faded onto the wall. The bed was gone, but the impression had remained. I went back out and dug around a little bit about the building, and then I realized and found that it was once bought by a wealthy Kachimeman businessman in the cantonment side of the city for his son. Then it became police headquarters, it became a lodge, then currently it is a warehouse. This one site had gone through so many transitions that had been evolving over a period of time. Who was this building today? What was I to make of it? How was I to represent it? I wasn't so sure. And then I realized that if I had to look at my city through a memory of the past and the memory of use again, what would I make of it? The prehistoric campsite, a trading post where Roman coins have been discovered, an early urban settlement, a military outpost during the Maratha period, a fortified gate town before that, then a site of invention and technology in the 18th century, a pensioner's paradise, the garden city, the Silicon Valley of India, and now Tech Halli. So what was I to make of Bangalore today? And how was I to locate myself in it?
Alia, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you put it in presentation mode so we can see your slides a little?
How do I do that?
There's the little icon at the bottom where you see the 4 little squares and the one next to it.
Oh dear. Yes.
On the orange bar. No, come to the left.
Yeah.
So you can just, Mansi, you want to guide her better than I can.
Yeah. Sorry. Was I
Yeah,
speaking
where it says comments, there
Yes.
are 3 icons.
Yeah.
So if you just go to the 3rd icon there.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mansi.
Thanks,
Again.
Mansi.
No problem.
Okay. So this is the outside of the building that I walked into. And being a student of literature, this quote really appealed to me. And none of this should be changed by the fact that Hamlet lived here, and yet it has changed completely. Okay. Yeah. So the first step as I walked along was to create a setting and context for the work that I was doing, which was writing about the city. And walking was integrated with that to create a context for space, to assign symbolic meanings and value. This was what I looked for. And connecting people to place more meaningfully through stories was the objective that I had. The approach that I had to take, because of the changing nature of people and place, meant exploring the primary, qualitative, phenomenological, non-empirical approach to the inquiry. I had to view the city through a subjective lens, the lived experiences of the insider. To explore the meaning of the experience was extremely important to me because I was trying to locate myself in it. And I was going to do this by gathering stories that placed individual memory within the framework of collective memory. Because I'd already started walking, I adopted it as a research method to position myself in and not outside the spatial experience. The field work that we did was an embodied spatial practice. It included walking, collecting memories, stories, impressions, images, and objects, mapping themes and parameters. How am I going to look at space? Interviews and conversations was the crux on which all this rested. And then this was supported, the structure was supported by archival research. So I went back to the libraries, back to the books, literally my familiar space, supporting it with secondary material, text, images, and media. And then telling the story required interpretation. And this process for me evolved very organically year after year as I went along. Also, being a theatre practitioner a while ago, the body was extremely important to me in the walking process. And today I wanted to share how the practice has evolved through using the body as a tool as I walked through the city. Walking on the go brought up questions for me. How do I respond to place when I walk intentionally or I stand and I linger? How would I frame place through the subjective experience? How would I allow for things to happen to me? What would my interactions be as I walked along? And then what were my observations? There's a lot that has been written on walking, I know that, but I also found that more than walking, lingering was something that also helped me find a lot of my stories. There were days where I would just sit in one place. I wouldn't move. I would just sit and watch things and gather impressions, the temporal nature of place, paying attention to gestures, to stance, to people, the way they looked, the way they spoke with me, and somehow the city would gather around me and it would begin to speak with me. So I realized that when I walk at a personal level, I was responding to place. And when I just sat still, doing absolutely nothing, place was speaking to me. Over a period of time, I'm going to share with you right now our first experiment in understanding collective memory. There were 6 city-based photographers who interpreted their experience of city identity through visual stories. So everybody walked and everybody chose the images that most represented Bangalore to them. And the questions that were asked were, what is my emotional relationship with place, my immediate environment? And can a collective identity, which was the objective, the quest, can a collective identity for Bangalore emerge through shared experiences of the city? So the experiment was to see whether we could get visual stories of the city and juxtapose them against text-based stories that were written in by people who had never met the photographer, and nobody knew each other either. As we went along and we started putting things up, the hangers represent in this installation a city that is hanging in a balance, and a lot of the things that are hanging in the balance with it. We realized that for each image that came up, there was a story that was corresponding to it. So there was an image of Alsur Lake, and there was a story of someone going on a scooter ride with their father every Sunday to Alsur Lake. There was a picture of the Koshi's, famous Koshi's sugar bowl, and there were stories of plays being written, politics being discussed, and love happening at the tables at Koshi's with that sugar bowl as a silent witness. When we put these together, we realized that there was a shared city that everybody inhabited at different points in time. This is one of the stories that came up, and it talked about Sir, which all of us in the city know. And he says, this free give and take of a respect currency, regardless of your bank balance and social status, in my opinion, makes us all Bangaloreans. It also makes us all a little more human. Using the body as a tool, I also have a background in psychology, and right now I'm training to be an expressive arts practitioner. So the body has always been of deep interest to me in the process of walking and the practice of walking as well. So field work for me was an embodied practice. It was being the researcher versus doing research. So I had to look at the body in space as a primary tool through which I filtered all my information and my lived experiences through primarily the old city area. I had to see the place as a site of embodied emotional expression and experiences. There's a lot that happens. Anyone who walks through the old city area knows it's like sights and sounds and smell and color and audio inputs, which can be overwhelming. What would I make of it? The embodiment was through physical and psychological presence and interactions. How am I when I'm in this space, and how do I keep responding to it, and how does it respond to me? I also used emotions as information, the tangible and the intangible experience. What do I think of it? How do I feel when I'm in this place? What is my need right now? Where did the feeling for security or prosperity create the fortified city and the pete? It's feeling and need again. Noticing sensory experience and perception. There were many sensorial walks that we used to do in a time when we could walk through the city safely, and look at how we could map the area through taste and smell and touch and hearing. If you didn't have signs and street names and you just had to go by your nose, how did you know the spice market near KR Market was coming? And how did you identify the flower market? Just using our olfactory senses. Where do we hear the temple bells? Where do we hear cows? Where do we smell dung? Where do we find horse carts? It was all connected. A couple of months later, I was invited by NID, and this was facilitated by Tanishka Kachru. And with the NID students, to kick off their project, it was a pop-up exhibition on interactive design. We walked again through the pete area, and this time, the outcome of the walks were some of these images that I'm sharing with you. The one in the top right-hand corner was the story of Rana Bairegowda and the flight to Avati across the borders. And this was done using the Wadli form. The image below that was the lost potters of Kumbarpet. So you actually you played a game with somebody else to build pots really fast, and the number of pots that you made in a specific time determined that you were the winner. Image recognition, the image in the middle, was image recognition at that point 5-6 years ago to map, translate, and sorry, there's an error there, and also transcribe epigraphic material, local inscriptions. In the corner over there is actually having discussions on site at the Ranganatha Swami temple in the pete area. The outcome of this was the pop-up exhibition. And as students walked and they evolved their narratives for the games that they were going to put out, they were integrating city stories, the lived experience of various communities, and their inhabitation of the city. But there was another layer that also came up, which was about multiplicity and polyvocality and plurality that was integrated into the narratives. These experiences are not possible when we sit behind walls, and working on city projects, studios, demanded, if I could use the word, connections, building connections and relationships with the city. Over a period of time, again, a lot of the walks at different times of day created these two walks that I used to do at one point in time. On the left-hand side was the Jasmine Trail, which is the story of the Karaga. It starts at 10 o'clock in the night and it ends at 6 o'clock in the morning. And year after year, I used to have about 20 or 25 people who very bravely walked with me all through the night across the Avenue Road and Pete area, mapping all the sites of significance to the community and the festival. The Nagarpet night walk was looking at migrant communities along one stretch of road. It was a walk, and there were about 9 or 10 different communities, the latest being the Bengali community who works on jewelry, small little pieces of jewelry for jewelry houses in the city. And the Cubbon Park Wayfinding and Signage Project, which was a collaboration with Sensing Local, was also looking at for me, it was looking at the temporal. So as I kept walking through Cubbon Park, there was a time when you would find the weaver's ant's nest, then you wouldn't find it again. Then you'll find the jacaranda blooming, and then there was soil and stones and flora, fauna. So the temporality of the park was also something that was woven into the wayfinding and signage components, which was the bloom cycle. So ways to walk in the park, things to look at in the park, and what you could stumble upon or discover were all integrated into the signage project. The blurring of boundaries came when I brought a background of psychology into the experience and employed the principles of what we call TC, therapeutic communication, to interviewing. So this was deep listening skills, being fully present when I walk or I linger, witnessing and observing without shifting, diverting, or distracting, holding space, staying still, and seeing what comes up, and practicing acceptance. So when you work with a client and these skills are used, I transferred them to my experience on the ground and waited for the city to speak with me. This is also what I crossed over the borders with, the window of tolerance as a researcher, which is extremely important. What is my level of arousal, the zones of arousal, to my emotional experiences of the city as I walk. Contraction and expansion was something that I noticed. So there were times when I would be occupying the space in the city by gender. If I was in a place like a Garadi Mane or a dargah or a mosque, I would learn how to contract my body so that I stayed neutral in a room full of men, because sometimes just being a woman was something that was uncomfortable for them. They were not used to it. So I learned to shrink, I learned to expand, I learned to be visible, I learned to be invisible using the body. What was my perception and experience of space through a sense of self? And what were my emotions and my state of mind as I walked also went into my information bank. The respectful model is again something from therapeutic communication, and this was, all researchers have a position or a stance, but this goes beyond just race, age, and gender. So the box on the right-hand side is what it encompasses. So when I walked and when I wrote, I had to be extremely mindful of where I was positioning myself in context to the city. And how was I viewing it through the lens of my profession or my identity locators? Walking made me embody all this as I went along. A while later, I was invited to collaborate with Art in Transit on this project, which you can see even now at the Metro Art Station in Chikpet. And the process that we employed with the artists was, again, the preamble, the prologue to the project, the work that they were going to do. And this involved situating ourselves and finding a point of reference for the study and the comparison of the area. Work was going to emerge from this. We had to pick parameters from which we would see the city, or themes that we would like to explore further. Reiteration was an important part of the process. So we walked along the same pathways more than once, independently and as a group, to understand patterns, flow, rhythms, and what the area was like at different points in time. Creating a setting for story collection. So everybody went out to collect their own impressions. They looked at boundaries, they looked at edges, and they built connections. Field notes were very important. Many of us wrote and mapped while we walked. There were interviews done with local stakeholders and groups that represented all the communities in the area. And then we came down to creating a curatorial strategy that interpreted all this material that had emerged from all the walks that happened in the Payday. In 2017 and 18, the Memory Maps workshop emerged from various experiments that had been happening along the way. And it came together at the Cubbon Park Metro Station. And the focus was, what do we choose to remember and what do we choose to forget? This integrated walking, again, storytelling and arts practice to create a neighborhood context and explore place-specific responses. The process that we employed over here was to walk, to make trails, to discover a locality, share stories with each other, map those stories, which are the images that you can see on the top, draw and write, and create a process of re-narration. We have done these workshops now in various localities of the city, and if it were not for COVID, we would have been happily doing many more. The outcome of these walks was re-embedding the stories. So it was really important that if we were taking stories from place, they have to go back to the places that they came from. And so each of the hope is that each of the workshops will have an artist book that emerges from the workshops, and this will archive individual and collective memory. This process was put together over various workshops that were put together by Arzu and me. So we walked and we drew, and we also integrated text-based stories. It's not very clear in this image right now, but it's on the right-hand side in the corner. And once again, the stories of textual memories that were contributed overlapped with maps that were drawn by people and ways in which they wanted to represent themselves in the city. Something has gone in. Yeah. And I'd just like to end now with something that inspired me deeply and began this whole journey of walking. Urban forms are made out of not only materials and things, but out of meanings, language, and symbols. It can be relatively easy to knock down a building, but it's much harder to demolish a space which is composed around experience, memory, and imagination. The outcome of the walks that I do have translated into various expressions, as you have seen. And over the last couple of years, I have walked with a variety of people, from tourists to design people, to artists, to marketing executives, to urban planners and interactive design students, to gamers looking to explore the spatiality of the city for inspiration. And I hope that as I go forward, the practice will evolve into deeper meanings that emerge from this city that I love and I seek to discover again, even if it is only in my stories and my memories.
Thanks, Alien.
How do I stop sharing?
Yeah, you could do that. I would like to invite our moderators to come forth and pose a question for you.
Hey, Mira, you have one question for Ali?
First of all, Alia, thank you for an extremely engaging and thought-provoking talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and I actually wished you didn't have to stop. There was so much to sort of, think about and take forward. I think you sort of answered what I was thinking about in the beginning in terms of uh, what is the takeaway when you begin to sort of embark on these journeys, because, and where do you start from? So is it about sort of possibly intuitive meandering? You spoke about sort of the emotive experience.
Mhm.
And then at what point do you begin to say, realize that maybe there is a path that I want to and I need to follow? Is there a transition, or at what point does it cease to be intuitive and a lot more sort of warranted in that way?
Hmm. There are two ways, Miran, that I approach this. Sometimes when I'm walking by myself, for myself, if I'm writing something, then I employ the meander and I spend a lot of time, like I said, just walking, just lingering, because then I have, it's not intentional. And when I walk with others, it's usually intention based, usually a studio or an objective that someone may have. And then we look at ways in which to see the city through the lens of that goal or that objective. So the area remains the same. I work largely in the old city area, say up to Carbon Park. That's my boundary and my edge. But I have found that because there are so many historic layers and layers of many other experiences as well, that every time there is a different studio and a different intention, that area just it uncovers one more layer to reveal itself, and then another layer to reveal itself. So irrespective of the intention or the meander, I always end up coming back to the same point, which is I have found allowing for the space to speak for itself, and following pathways and also going off them periodically. So it's a mix of both. But it usually, to answer your question, starts with an intention if I'm working with others.
Interesting. Thanks. Is there a point where, or has there been, during sort of your research, where you have come across possibly spaces that seem seemingly interesting and authentic, but then you found that maybe it was a lot more about pastiche and, things that are made to look like they had a lot more value than they didn't? Especially in sort of areas like Chickpet, where there is the sort of constant sort of cycling and recycling of both imagery and spaces.
Fortunately, not as yet. But now I am finding that in the recent past, just before the area closed down for COVID, a lot of the some of the spaces, and I won't be able to name them, but some of them now have that a need to present itself. Largely symbolic spaces, many religious spaces that are seeing themselves differently now and are not happy with the way they were represented earlier, which was much more authentic. And so there is this need, to cover up, to layer, to quote unquote, to renovate, to modernize. And that's where I face a huge challenge. Because when you come there with a story, or you're looking for a story, the place does not apply itself to that image anymore.
Right.
I think we'll reserve the other questions for the end of the presentations. Thanks, Alia. Thanks, Meera.
Thank you, Alia.
Yeah. So I invite Ali to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, we have with us Mansi S. Rao, who's an architect and a material culture researcher. Her interests lie at the intersection of heritage, particularly crafts and material culture, and ideas of development. As a senior research associate at DICRC CEPT University, she has worked with craft communities to facilitate craft design education and training programs to enable sustenance of traditional craft practices. She is a principal researcher on the vernacular furniture of Northwest India project, the first ever research on vernacular furniture in India. She has a bachelor's degree in architecture and an MA in Museums, Heritage and Material Culture Studies from SOAS, University of London. She was awarded the Chevening Scholarship 2017-18 and the Charles Wallace India Trust and Simon Digby Charitable Trust Scholarship 2017-18 to study and conduct research in the UK. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much, Salila, Madhuri, Deepa, Meera, Professor Bhavni, all of you for organizing this and considering me worthy of being part of this wonderful symposium that you all have organized. So I think much has been said about what I do, and over the last 8 years, I've been working with the Design, Innovation and Craft Resource Center at CEPT University, where the primary goal of the research that we have been doing is to understand ways in which traditional and vernacular craft practices, particularly in the sphere of built environments, can evolve and sustain themselves in current changing times. And today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've done and learned and our experiences through the lens of one particular project, which is the vernacular furniture project. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So, like I said, what I'm going to be talking about is this project called Vernacular Furniture of India, which we conducted at DICRC. And to start talking about the project, I'm going to go back to 2015, which is when the beginnings of this research happened. Back in 2015, Professor Jay Thakkar, who is the executive director of DICRC and a professor at CEPT, was invited to the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich in the UK. A small little private collection of furniture, architectural elements, objects that were collected over the last 40 years is housed in this museum.
Mansi,
you're muted. Okay, I have no idea how that happened, but so what I was saying is that back in 2015, Professor Jay was invited to the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich, a small little town in the UK, and the South Asia Collection is a collection of architectural elements, objects, furniture that were collected over the last 40 years from across South Asia by the trustees of the museum out of their own personal interest. So it's a small little private collection of everyday objects from across the region. And back in 2015, Professor Jay and the trustees of the museum were working on a small little project to identify some of the architectural pieces. And what they discovered was amongst all that variety of architectural elements and objects, there were a huge variety of furniture that was part of their collection, of which very little was known. So the image that you see here is actually a chest, and the label on it said Damachio, and nothing else was known, whether it was the records of the museum, whether it was through the stories of the trustees themselves who had collected these pieces. Nothing much was known. And thus began an inquiry of understanding what these furniture pieces could be, and a collaborative endeavor was set out between DICRC and the Sadat Trust, which takes care of the South Asia collection in Norwich. So before we could set out on the project, we had to ask ourselves what vernacular furniture meant, or what these types of furniture were actually. I want to start out with something called starting troubles that we experienced during the beginning of the project. And I think quite naturally, one of our first instincts was to look at history and look at what had been said about furniture of the kind that we had seen in the museum. And this is what we found. I just want to read out a couple of them. One of the early colonial officers who was also given the task of recording the arts of India, George Birdwood, said that in one of his piece of writing, he says, "If we may judge from the example of India, the great art in furniture is to do without it. Furniture in India is conspicuous chiefly by its absence." And James Todd, one of the most popular writers and travelers of that period, of the colonial period, also said in their household economy, their furniture and decorations, they remain unchanged during the lapse of 1,000 years. No chairs, no couches adorn their sitting apartments. Nothing but a soft carpet hidden by a white cloth on which the guests seat themselves according to rank. So when we started looking out to historical sources, we found more and more of these kind of quotes where it was said that India had absolutely no furniture. And if it did, it was all the furniture that had been brought by the West, and how craftspeople in India had copied the furniture pieces that had been made there. And even if people did identify some pieces, this is how they described it. So the image on the left that you see is a street view of Bikaner, documented back in 1893 by Edwin Lord Weeks. And he wrote in his records, "The people have a way of keeping what at first sight appear to be their dining tables in front of their houses or in the middle of the street for purposes of social intercourse and for playing little games which resemble chess." So even if there was any mention of any kind of local furniture that was used, it was always equated with English names. So with the absence of any kind of historical sources, we turned to art history for some cues. And when we started looking at collections in galleries and art pieces, which dates back to 15th, 16th, 17th centuries of miniature paintings and traditions, we did notice that you see glimpses of furniture. So we knew they existed, and definitely the records had missed out something. And if you see, there's a small little chair, and also we had the South Asia collection to bank on, and you see a similar piece that was part of the collection. And there you see a small little low surface on which food is being served, and then there were similar pieces that were there in the collection. But however, I think what we had missed out is in understanding what these pieces were actually. So we decided to embark on this project, and we started working in the region of Northwest India, which covered Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and Haryana, mainly because the collection had a lot of these furniture pieces which were speculated to be from that region. So starting from 2015 to 2021, we conducted this project over different phases, mainly for the ease of geographic reach. And when we started out, after a historical inquiry, we started looking at what parameters one had to look at to understand vernacular furniture. And we looked at existing ways of understanding what vernacular meant. Of course, in the context of architecture, much research has been done. So we picked up on keywords like the idea of local material, which of course comes from a design mode of inquiry. And then the fact that they are regionally rooted, again, coming from a sense of cultural geography. And then, of course, when you're talking about anything vernacular, one has to remember that the roots are from, or rather the way vernacular has come into being is from the sense of language and linguistics. So we couldn't ignore the connections that furniture would have to language. So based on these three parameters, we set out conducting field work. And we did some pre-field research in terms of understanding where we could go. So we did some initial studies. And on one of the early field trips that we did in Rajasthan, obviously the place and context has so much of a role to play. It's hot, dry, arid. And everywhere we went, we realized that water had a very important role to play in the everyday life of people, much like everywhere else. And at the entrance of small vernacular houses, water pot would be placed in small niches to wash our feet and hands as we entered the houses. And a similar niche would be placed at the entrance or constructed at the entrance of the house, from which water would be offered to drink. And then we started seeing glimpses of what we understood as furniture at that point. Some of the pieces in museum collections, again and again, we were returning to collections. So small stands like this, which were used to store water pots and water pitchers. And then we ended up in the villages of Rajasthan, where something that was meant for the same purpose, for water storage and water pitcher storage, became part of the built environment. We started seeing inbuilt furniture for these activities. And then as we moved forward, we realized that the same activity of water storage expanded to become a space, really. So in the Havelis of Shekhawati, there is a dedicated room that is meant for storing water pots and water pitchers, mainly because of the number of people who lived in these Havelis. And then as we traveled across Rajasthan, we realized that extending water to guests, water to visitors, or to anybody who felt the need for it was not just limited to the comfort or the boundaries of a physical space as such in terms of furniture, but it also transformed into public spaces. So what you see here is called a pyavu, and there are public water rooms like this across the land, dotted across the landscape of Rajasthan. And anyone can walk in here and have a glass of water. There's a small little donation box. You put in whatever you can or whatever you can't. It's completely fine. And the community around takes care of these public water rooms. And as we moved forward, we realized our own premise of this local materials, we had begun to question it, because we started seeing metal coming into picture. And essentially, what you see here is again an extension of the public water room meant for passers-by outside a house in Churu in Rajasthan. So essentially, we started realizing that there was something more than materials to look at in the context of vernacular furniture. And essentially, it was all rooted in the context of water. As we met people, we started hearing many proverbs, almost what they call kehvat in these parts of the country. In Gujarat, there's a saying which says "Bar game boli badlai base ane pani," which means every 12 villages, the language changes, the clothes change, the attire changes, and the taste of water changes. And similar sayings exist in different languages across Northwest India. So we realized, again, the connections of region, the connections of language were becoming more and more evident. And one of the things that we had to do while starting out is to set out on this premise that culture is not really an island. And these boundaries of districts and states were essentially not going to serve the purpose of understanding what vernacular furniture meant. And hence, in a manner of understanding the geographical influences, we had to rely on cultural regions that have existed far beyond and prior to demarcation of state and administrative boundaries. And then we started looking at even the most common furniture pieces that we could identify at that point of time. The ubiquitous charpoi that exists across the length and breadth of the country, in fact. But then we realized that even this charpoi had several names across just Gujarat and Rajasthan alone. Somewhere it was called a dholio, another place it was called a khatlo, another place it was called a khatli. So what were these, how were these defined? Was it just different names that were given to these pieces? What was the difference? Because a lot of times we couldn't look at these pieces, look at the design and understand really what the difference was. So we realized that even after all this, we were somewhere going back to understanding and identifying furniture in a way that was always known to us. We were looking at classification methods like bed and chair and benches and tables, which are our notions of furniture that as handed down to us. And we realized that we were going wrong somewhere in terms of looking at furniture. So we began to introspect further, and then we said, in the context of vernacular, instead of focusing only on the way buildings and artifacts are made, it is important to focus on how people use them, dwell, appropriate, convert, demolish, and rebuild them. And then the answers become more clear. So for us, at that point, we realized there was the need for an approach that went beyond just understanding it from the design perspective. And that's where we started looking at anthropology as a way to look at vernacular furniture. And we started asking, what can context, people, communities, everyday practices, social structures tell us about furniture as much as materials and techniques and crafts can tell us about furniture. And when we started out on this, we began to elaborate our process and tools for this search of vernacular furniture. And one of the initial struggles we realized was documenting and identifying architecture was quite easy because one could just walk on the streets and still be able to identify some of these vernacular buildings and traditional buildings. But furniture meant one had to walk into people's houses, their own private spaces, to identify and locate these furniture pieces, which meant the first task at hand was to establish a large trust-based network where the people who we were visiting could trust us and let us into their homes. So it began with identifying people. So if I knew somebody and I asked them, would you know anyone who would have vernacular furniture? They would connect me to a third person, and then that third person to another 10 people who they would know. So using this sort of a personal network building approach, we were able to establish connections across Northwest India, where personal associations were established close to about 4,000 families across Northwest India for the documentation of this project. And it was an organic process, of course. And then once we identified or made these connections with people, we set out on fieldwork. And fieldwork was conducted in various spaces. There were residences we visited, there were warehouses we visited, religious spaces, public spaces, museums across these regions. So in the identifying of furniture, what we realized is that use played a huge role. And through the process of conducting this research, we realized that there was a different way we had to look at identifying furniture. And we started looking at the use of furniture as a key to start classifying them. So we broadly looked at 5 categories. This was, of course, devised after a large number of furniture pieces were identified and recorded. So there were seating, sleeping, storage, surfaces, and objects, which helped us group these objects together. And as we went along the project, we were able to identify various pieces under each of these categories of furniture pieces. And now at the end of this project, we've been able to develop a typology chart. And this was a way to identify furniture for us. And we've identified close to about 120 types of furniture across Northwest India, which can be classified as vernacular. And in the process of locating furniture, we started relying on technology and GIS tools. So a specific real-time mapping form was developed where we could start entering information about the furniture piece and its location. And we've actually developed a map that pinpoints all these documented furniture pieces in their context. And we were able to actually locate about 7,000 vernacular furniture pieces across Northwest India. The second aspect, after we identified these pieces, was to understand what are these stories. So from an anthropological perspective, we started looking at what stories did these furniture pieces have to share. We relied on tools such as field notes and photography and audiovisual recordings to capture oral histories of people. There were also object-specific forms that we started devising from a more museological perspective of object studies. And in some spaces, I think Ali has very wonderfully spoken about the nuances one experiences while conducting fieldwork. In some places, we were welcome. In some places, we were not. Some places, we were asked to come share a meal with them. In others, we were simply not allowed in spaces where the head of the family was not around. And while doing so, I just want to share a few stories that we discovered. So this is a traditional vernacular home in Barmer in Rajasthan. It's called a Dani. And this is the lady, Tari Devi, who actually was involved in building her own home. And what you see on the screen is called a kathatra or a kotlio. It's a larder that is specifically built in parts of Barmer and Jaisalmer to preserve food that's cooked every day. And the kind of stories that we started discovering when we used this approach was the nuances of how crafting these furniture pieces are passed on in an informal manner beyond the boundaries of traditional craft practices, which are slightly more formally organized with apprenticeship and a generational hand down of knowledge that's given. And Tari Devi told us what's written here. She says that they actually learned how to make these pieces from their mother-in-law, and you would see the differences when somebody more skilled was making it versus somebody who's younger who was making it. And this kotlio was actually made by her about 40 years ago when she had just gotten married and come into the house. And then in Punjab, there were other kinds of stories that we started discovering. This idea of marriage and furniture has strong ties is something that we discovered. So what you see on screen here is a sanduk, and it's essentially a cabinet, wooden cabinet that's given to the daughter of the family with all her belongings when she gets married and moves to the husband's house. And in Punjab, of course, the stories of migration, the stories of the partition and memories take precedence over anything else when you start looking at furniture. And this particular sanduk, the family has treasured it as a memory of the eldest lady of the family who had received it during her marriage. And if you notice closely, you'll see that one of the legs is slightly different and has been repurposed over time. And the reason this had been done is because the family had actually carried this sanduk during the partition. And later on again, they lived closer to the border areas, and another time when they had to relocate, they had carried it again and the leg had broken off. So they've replaced it, and they say that it's purposely kept plain and different to remind them of those times when they had to actually travel with these objects across borders and across different places. And then again, there were pieces like this that we discovered where this charpoy, which is called a manja in Punjab, the family you see seated on it did not actually own this charpoy originally. It belonged to a neighbor who had migrated to Pakistan during the partition and had left it with the father of this elderly gentleman. And this man was a young boy at the time. And they had said they would come back and collect the furniture, but unfortunately, they have not been able to return. And this family has preserved, Mangaram's family has preserved this charpoy as a means to remember and cherish the friendships that were shared pre-partition. So several stories like this started coming out. This is just a glimpse that I've been able to put together. And the second aspect from the perspective of design was to analyze the crafts, analyze how these pieces were made. So we relied on field sketches, understanding various craft processes, of how these furniture pieces are made, various materials and techniques that are used. So we relied on field sketches, measure drawings to start documenting these pieces of furniture. And then, of course, in current times, looking at how softwares can help us in terms of developing drawings. And then the drawing itself became a tool to understand these pieces. So we were able to develop exploded drawings to understand construction, joinery, techniques that were used to make these pieces of furniture. And then the fourth part to this methodology of the project was to actually use the collection. So earlier on, I spoke about the South Asia collection and the collection having a large number of vernacular furniture pieces, which were obviously out of context in many ways. And this was one piece which was labeled the Banswara chest, and nothing else was known about it. And for a long time into the research, we had not come across anything of this sort on field. So we were beginning to wonder whether this was actually from the region at all or not. And then we decided to go with the cues that the object label had in the museum. Banswara is a place in southern Rajasthan, and we set out to that region to look at things. And then fortunately, we had a student at CEPT who said his family actually comes from a family of carpenters, traditional Suthars, and live in Dungarpur, which is the neighboring district of Banswara. And there we set out to meet Mr. Jagdish Suthar. And at his home, we realized he owned a wonderful jhula, which had been handed down to him by his grandfather. And we heard this story about how the grandfather had 3 sons, and all 3 sons had been given a piece of furniture that the grandfather had made. And he told us about the kind of tools and the kind of things that he makes currently. So of course, while you're doing field research, you never encounter things that you really want to encounter, but there are all these in-betweens that end up happening, and you just have to absorb it all because they all have stories to tell. And then when he took us to his brother's house, there it was. We discovered our first Banswara chest as it was known, but then later we got to know that it's actually called a Maju. And the interesting thing about this Maju is that each Maju is uniquely made. Only the Suthar community in Rajasthan would make it. It's unique to the southern part of Rajasthan. And it's unique because it can be opened only through a sequential joinery system that exists in the Maju. And it was used essentially as a safe storage, and therefore could not be opened by anybody else except the head of the family. So what we realized from Jagdish ji was that no 2 Maju were ever identical because of this locking mechanism. And we walked into a house where this gentleman showed us how these secret compartments opened out. But of course, he would not share the entire process of opening up the Maju with us. And then we identified several Maju across the region. We were able to contextualize what this chest meant in the context of the museum. And then because of this sequential opening system and the fact that nobody was able to share with us how it was actually opened, we had not been able to open up any Maju or make a drawing of this to understand how it was made. And then we relied on one of the pieces that existed in the South Asia collection. A visit was made to Norwich by some of our research team members. And in the process, we realized that the Maju at the museum had never been opened up. And in the process of discovery, we also realized it had 16 sequential secret compartments, and some of which you see here. It's all just made through simple joinery mechanisms in wood. And therefore, by using the collection, we were actually again able to prepare drawings of this Maju. And by the end of this process, we've now been able to give a more meaningful definition or get a more coherent understanding of what vernacular furniture means, perhaps. And this is what we've left it at for the moment. What we've realized is that also it's continually evolving, these definitions. So there was use to be factored in, there was crafts to be factored in, there was community, there was people, there was region, and a sense of identity to be factored into understanding vernacular furniture. And beyond just understanding it, there were many lessons to be learned. And the most heartwarming of it all was this idea that vernacular furniture was almost ubiquitous across communities, across different groups of people. and across different landscapes. So we've been able to record some of these pieces in rural areas. So you see a pidha, which is a low stool. You see a cradle, and in its most frugal form is made out of a fabric, which in Gujarati is called khoyu, which also has several local differences in names. And then there's the manja, which is again a really common piece of furniture you see everywhere. And again, in the urban spaces, you started seeing the same pieces of furniture, but perhaps with a difference in the materiality. And then we had also access to several royal collections as well. And then we realized that indeed these pieces were common across different places. And although I think it would be highly simplistic to have that point of view, but yet it was quite heartwarming to see that even though materials differed, even though affordances differed, there was a sense of everyday practice, cultural associations that were common across people in the region. And then the other thing that we realized is that these pieces of furniture are not used in isolation, but also become part of what people begin to make sense of as home. This is the kitchen in a house in again southern Rajasthan, and you see all these inbuilt cabinets, and each one has a different story. So what you see here along the wall is called an ada and is used to store various utensils. But the same thing, when it's made in the corner of these two walls, is called a tangkhunia. And a tangkhunia would be used to store valuables by the women of the family. I think perhaps a lot of us have heard our grandmothers having to store money in their kitchen boxes and their spice boxes. Similarly, these women have various stories to share in terms of how they put together small bits of money and their valuables and jewels into this tangkhunia. And if you notice, there's a small little latch only on this and not on the other two inbuilt cabinets. And the reason they say it's built like this across the two corners is because when you make an inbuilt cabinet, which is an ada, you eat up into the wall, you create a niche, whereas at the corner you actually build in front, and for someone to dig in or break in from the outside was apparently difficult. And these are the kind of stories that you start hearing. And in the same house, you see a paniara, which is a water pitcher storage used to store water. And then you see charpoys, and you see various granaries, which again are of different kinds, koti, kotho, kotla, based on the type of grain that needs to be stored in it as well. So it almost becomes this bricolage of objects and furniture that begin to add meaning to a space and begin to add meaning to home as people would imagine it to be. And one of the things that we looked at through the research is how this can actually translate into resource. With this research being the first ever research, how can it become a resource for further use? So all these mapped furniture pieces have been put together in different catalogs on the different regions. And this uses a more museological perspective where there's a small little object-specific information provided to the set of objects that are shown here, furniture that are shown here. And all the drawings that have been prepared have been compiled into what we call the drawing portfolio. And it's a compilation of all the various types of drawings of furniture that we've identified. And all these stories and a more thematic and academic point of view has been collated into research publications, books on the subject. And there's books on each region that's been written up. We've done Gujarat and Rajasthan so far, and Punjab and Haryana is in the process. So this offers a more sort of cohesive insight into stories, into drawings and materials and techniques and architecture of the region. And then we put together a website which can actually become a resource platform. So everything that I've showcased so far, the stories, the mapped objects, mapped furniture, everything is up online. And this extensive typology is also up online. So we've looked at developing this portal as a resource mainly stemming from this research ethic that we've followed at the center always, of how research has to be shared for it to have any meaning and for it to have any use. And for us, this project was timely because the vernacular is vanishing in many ways. Lifestyles are changing, affordances are changing, affordabilities are changing. And these are very, very quickly finding their way into the antique market as we know it, and are being put out of context of the wonderful stories and meanings and experiences and memories that these objects hold. And we believe that there is an afterlife to this research, and it does not stop here. It's just the beginning. And these are some of the areas where we think it can be useful. But it's for us to wait and watch what happens with this knowledge that has been created. And of course, a project of this scale and nature does not happen single-handedly. A group of wonderful people that I've had the privilege of working with through the last 6 years on this project. And before I leave you, I just want to share this, that we were eventually able to contextualize the dining table that Edwin Weeks was talking about. It's actually a pata, again, unique to the walled city of Bikaner in Rajasthan. You still see people sitting on it. Perhaps back then they were what looked like little games of chess, but now they play a game of cards. And these public benches form an integral part of Bikaner's public landscape, of the walled city. And there are various stories associated with the pata, and which is all up online as well. You can also explore it on your own. But these are some wonderful things that we've learned during the course of the project. So small joys of discovering and making connections of past to the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mansi. I didn't know that you were full of furniture stories. Had I known, I would have poked you earlier, It is so amazing to see that how an intention set about 7 years back developed into a full-blown research project back with team and the methodology. I think the students can take a lot back with them with regard to the methodology, how you complete a research project, right to the point of you publishing the resource, which is accessible to people. Thanks a lot. And actually, as you're going through the presentation, I think you almost answered the imminent question. I also have a question about the long-term plan. You did say that you're looking at, this is just a starting point in making it into a resource. And I was wondering about what your thoughts were with your team regarding the craft revival, which is pertinent to this region and the projects. Like now you have documented it, you have the resource to access. You've also gone to the extent of sort of drawing it out, speaking to the family community who can make it. So the sort of plan for the craft revival is the imminent question. The other question, I was just thinking that when you were talking about the different pieces, I think the charpai, you termed it as the Gujarat word is katlu, is that right?
Katlo.
Katlo, okay. And I was just thinking in Tamil, it's called kattil. The same thing is called kattil. So I was suddenly curious of how, given the purpose is the same, maybe there was maybe something traveled, maybe the word was adapted. And similarly, I was also getting reminded of one of my clients who's like a wildlife photographer. He was telling me about how the idea of plates work in Meghalaya. So in each family, apparently there are these stool-like structures, which is usually stored in an attic. So the youngest person will have the smallest bowl carved out of, obviously, locally available wood, propped up on these 4 legs. So you actually sit and then the stool comes to your level. Like you sit cross-legged in the floor and you eat. And depending on the number of people that there are, you'll see that many stools on the attic. And you'll obviously know the biggest one is for the head of the family. And he was telling me how he had to coax and get one of them, back to Bangalore, and he uses it as like a side table. So when you spoke about the context, I got reminded of the story. So the long-term question I have for you is like, you literally just, hit the tip of the iceberg, given how big India, how old it is, and how, different the regions are. Are there plans to sort of cover pan-India with this kind of research? Or have you guys set a module up that can be sort of adapted, and taken forward?
So I'll start with what you asked me first, this idea of craft revival. So I think one thing we realized, Deepa, through the course of the project is that heritage, in any sense that we understand it, is not a stagnant commodity as such. It changes, it evolves, and much like aspirations change across borders, even these craftspeople, they have their own aspirations, they have their own understanding of what life needs to become for them. Of course, a lot of them take pride in what they do, but I think in the context of furniture per se, because lifestyles are changing, the need for producing furniture or the need for crafting furniture as once it was is reducing. And even if it is being made, unfortunately, it is in these large warehouses in the industrial areas of Rajasthan, from where they end up mainly in the export market, where they are being sold off as dog beds. Like charpoys are actually marketed as dog beds, in the export market. So, and then all these chests and cabinets that these women have carried with them through generations as being handed down, handed down as part of such an intimate ritual or ceremony, they end up being cut up and being made into bar consoles. So I think what's happening is, because the markets have changed, because the needs have changed, lifestyles have changed, the way to adapt and evolve is something people are struggling to understand. But some people are doing it. For example, if you look at the carved makers of Rajasthan, the storytelling practice is reducing greatly. But some craftspeople, what's happened now is that they've started converting carved into educational tools for teaching young children. So you'll see craftspeople painting motifs of alphabets in local languages on the carved. So they end up becoming tools for education. So I think the meanings and purposes of these are changing, and therefore the way crafts are interpreted is also changing. And I think the second is, of course, with the changing landscapes, climate, geography, that is becoming such an important part of discourse now. I think a lot of raw materials come from immediate surroundings, and with changing landscapes, even the raw materials used in the production of these furniture pieces are changing. Like, for example, if you see the mudha that we see even across here, you see craftspeople from northwestern parts coming to the south and making these chairs and stools. Apparently, at one point of time, this grass moonj, which they use in the making of these chairs and stools, was so abundantly available. Now, in the entire region, they all source it only from Ajmer, where it grows. And hence, a lot of the other craftspeople in the region have started making cotton ropes or nylon ropes in the making of these. So I think it's a continuously evolving process. And perhaps there is no single answer to how these crafts can revive themselves in a singular manner. Maybe there are diverse ways to look at it. Second thing, this idea of the katlo, and you said katl. Is that what it's called in Tamil?
Yeah.
And I think it's the same, right? In Punjab, it's called a manja. In Kannada, it's actually called a mancha. And And then I happened to be showing this to an Iranian professor of mine. And she told me about how exactly similar charpoys are found in Iran. And then another archaeologist once pointed out that similar charpoy legs were actually found during the excavations in Greece. So, again, culture is not an island, like I said earlier. So I think there are different, there are boundaries that have been transcended, like geographical boundaries, and there are influences which have come in, and we have made them our own in so many ways. And I think that's what it is. So there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot to be discovered. This is just the beginning. The fact that this is called this is used for this, then gives rise to these further questions. And we're hoping that these questions can be answered in the future. And if there are any plans, yes, if the pandemic hadn't happened, the plan was to start off with the south of India. And the fact that all our research projects get converted into toolkits and frameworks, because we believe that research of this kind, of this scale, cannot be conducted by a single organization or individuals. And our research practice has always worked on open source principles. So yes, happy for anyone else to take it up and do it. We intended to do South India. We're hoping that at some point, once things calm down and things get better, we will be able to do something. But yeah, the intention is for this to become a repository of vernacular furniture for the whole of India, and eventually, I think, to be identified as part of the material culture of the country.
I do hope that just like how the textile industry saw a revival, right, even among the urban community, though the context changed, it is become the norm to know about what is authentic, and go for it. So I do wish that this, takes on a wave like that. So fantastic. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.